how do we paint deeply disturbing flesh in the Grimdark style? You may be under the impression that the Grimdark style is nothing more than grime and dirt. And this is probably our fault, because what we teach on YouTube is often aimed at a wider audience to get new people to try out the basics. But there's way more behind the style. A ton of nuance and obscure techniques that we employ. One of these is the glue technique, perfect for layering paints and creating unbelievable textures. So stay a while and let's find out what is the glue technique. I'm Dark Ages Workshop and I welcome you to the Grimdark Compendium. When we started working with the glue technique, we quickly realized the immense potential of this practice and how it could be implemented for miniature painting, especially in the Grimdark style. As we always seek creative new ways to use paints, we're in a constant search for interesting textures. Especially when we get up close, we're always looking for those micro variations, mottling, and realistic surface finishes. The glue technique is immensely helpful for what we want to achieve and has now become a staple of our methodology for multiple reasons. First of all, it opens up the possibility for layering paints and techniques that typically would not work together. For example, it allows us to layer oils and enamels safely without interfering with each other. Normally, they would reactivate or blend due to the solvent contained in the paint. But with the glue, we create a physical, crystal clear layer that also generates real distance and therefore real depth to our surfaces. It's even possible to mix pure pigments with the superglue to get some coloration to our layers and adding further nuance to our recipes. It also generates unique granular textures and surface variations that we normally wouldn't be able to get with any other product or paint to the same extent. The glue adds a particular shiny effect that is different from that of a varnish, and that can be turned down and controlled while painting. Make sure to watch our video on surface finish variation to get the complete picture about this matter. It's one of the staples of the Grimdark style and is often disregarded. Last but not least, the glue opens up a safe way to use the reductive technique using acrylics and alcohol. A lot of our teachings revolve around subtraction, and the reductive technique is one of the absolute most important principles at our disposal. So being able to safely reduce acrylics using alcohol with no concern of dissolving your paint back to the plastic is a huge deal and opens up immense possibilities for filtering, flesh effects, veining, and so much more. So let's start painting this screamer here and try to make this look really to a level that looks uncomfortable to look at. I start with a pale sage primer. Give it about 15 minutes to dry, then come in with a pass of Vallejo Model Air Red. I make sure to get this one under the eyes, pinchers, the contours of the fins, and all the way up to the tail. And as a second pass, I come in with Flesh Terrors Red and reinforce the details at the very extremities, mainly the very tips of the fangs. Then I will use Vallejo Mecha Ivory Primer with just a drop of Flow Improver at 25 psi and keeping it very light just from the top. We want to keep this translucent so that we can still see the previous colors shining through and get those nice natural looking transitions from the pale green to red to ivory. The mandibles and the very tips of the fins are gonna stay mostly untouched by this pass. So I get this on most of the erased areas, and if it's a bit spattery, it's not too much of an issue. Typically with flesh recipes in the Grimdark style, it can be beneficial to have some mottling going on, like little skin flaws and blotches, so we can accept these spots and variations, but only to a certain degree. In general, with the glue technique, we want to make sure to start very bright with luminosity and also with quite a lot of saturation and value. So, just in case, if in doubt, go lighter from the very start. So, to reiterate, before we get to the glue application, we want to make sure we have our luminosity and color values nice and solid. I mean, even a simple two-step fade could work. A base color and an undershade. But I will go with an additional shadow sketch of cardboard crimson just to give extra depth and respect what the sculpt is suggesting to me. And now it's finally the time to start talking about this glue. First of all, I want to specify that when I refer to the glue technique, I always mean superglue or cyanoacrylate glue. Now, do not skip this next part because safety and health are #1 priority, so please pay close attention. Being exposed to the fumes of superglue is highly detrimental to your health in the long term. You may know that it reacts with moisture and humidity, and it can generate some nasty fumes. I insist that before you attempt this, you should get yourself a face shield with integrated mask and interchangeable filters, or a combination of protective goggles and respirator. As far as what glue to use, I recommend the thinnest you can find and with an almost water-like consistency. Starbond Thin is probably the best choice, but I use this Loctite with integrated applicator and it's pretty much my best option in Europe. They behave a bit differently and have both advantages and disadvantages. Loctite comes with this convenient applicator made of polypropylene, a synthetic material that can withstand the properties of superglue. It stays soft as long as it's submerged in glue, so don't expose this to air too much and pay attention to not contaminating this with any paint or water. Loctite is thin enough but still slightly dense. This means that applications will be a bit more textured and uneven, and thus particularly suited for organic and soft surfaces. Starbond Thin, on the other hand, has quite literally the consistency of water. This means we can achieve extreme quality self-leveling results for both organic and hard surfaces like armor, for example. It's easier to create even layers, but due to being almost like water, it means it's prone to be quite runny. So be careful with your brush load, or we'll start running and following gravity just like water. It also doesn't come with any applicator, so you'll need to find expendable polypropylene brushes on your own, of which you may unfortunately waste a mountain in the process. Before I proceed with the screamer, I just want to show you the basic principle onto a piece of plastic card. If you decide to try this yourself, use something like this as a practice blank. Remember that there is no turning back from this technique. After applying base color and shade, I dry them thoroughly with a hairdryer. I'll apply the glue pretty hastily for two main reasons. Just so you can see the amount of texture that we can accidentally build up if we come too aggressive and careless. It can become really uneven if we let it pull too much, or even if we come with an incorrect brush load, either too scarce or too heavy, or if the bristles have become too old and stiff. And the second reason is that this is a flat, wide surface. No curvatures, no segments, no added volumes or confinements, no nothing. So I feel the need to make it a bit more interesting and uneven for painting purposes. It is to be said that these small inconsistencies tend to get fixed pretty easily. As long as the glue is still wet, All you need to do is move the brush back and forth and add a bit more glue and never letting one single area dry too much. Now I'll show you how the glue reacts to moisture. This could be paint, or water, or mineral spirits, or even a humidity in your studio. See, this generates a white crust. This phenomenon can be partially fixed by using a bit more glue on the top. But then, if it gets of this entity, then I'm afraid there's not much you can do to bring it back. But actually, if you see the possibilities beyond the mistake, nothing can stop you from doing this on purpose to create a unique and frankly pretty cool textures for your projects. Just as we said, the glue opens up windows of opportunities for lots of surface variations. Just be careful when you're working with oils or enamels. Before you cover those with glue, it will be good practice to wait at least 24 to 48 hours, or you could risk having some of these crusty effects appearing on your paint job. So now the glue is set and completely dry, and I can start coming in with some acrylic filters and the Reductive Technique. This is isopropyl alcohol 99%, and it's one of the most aggressive solvents we can possibly use. So let's get this solvent onto the surface and notice how it immediately starts to decimate the acrylic wash. You see that around the droplets of alcohol, the pigments gets absolutely obliterated. And if I come in with a hairdryer and flash this off, we are left with this very interesting situation here. This was the Cardboard Crimson shade by Citadel, and it dissolves typically pretty effortlessly. Additionally, you can also notice that as we dissolve the wash, the pigments get amassed into each other, creating micro variations in volume in the shape of capillaries. We can lead these pigments out of the way with our brush, aided by the slippery, indestructible surface laid down by the superglue. If we hadn't had the glue underneath, with this level of pressure and the quantity of solvent used, the isopropyl alcohol would have easily dissolved all the paint back to the bare plastic. Another interesting thing to note is that in these areas where we removed or spattered the alcohol, we also turned down the extreme shine of the glue from like 100% to a 10% in very selected areas. So, with my coat of glue, I have just created the perfect playground to introduce paints or filters that I can manipulate with no concern, and I can start layer this up pretty much indefinitely. And this is one of the main reasons why a simple gloss varnish could never substitute the efficiency of the glue technique or even remotely achieve the same results. The fast curing time, the extreme resistance, the opportunity for texture, and the way we can control the amount of shine after the application, in all these aspects, the glue technique is simply the better option. Especially if you are looking for those variations and different levels of intensity, of texture, of color and finish, and so much more. After the crimson removal, we have these shapes that look like a hematoma or something similar. But to render realistic flesh, we need to make these look sunken deeper within the epidermis. So I will come in with a slight filtering of ivory and another layer of glue, reinstating the glossiness and fixing all previous inconsistencies in volume as the glue starts to level itself and creates a real three-dimensional space between our crimson veins and our new layer. This will get more noticeable with multiple passes of glue. So I repeat the same principle using the cold tone of a Colia green shade, just a touch here on the left and right sides in selected spots, just to keep the variation. So now let's bring more IPA 99% and start dissolving once again. alternating between a spatter technique and just light touches, mildly loaded. Let's try to avoid creating artificial looking patterns here. We want this chaotic, but always a bit under control, with a suitable amount of veins and shapes expanding in all directions. A bit horizontal, a bit vertical, and always keeping different sizes and capillarity. No two veins look exactly the same, and there is no symmetry. And we could keep going with more filters and more layers of glue, but for now, it will suffice for me. And all I did after this was giving a bit more texture using enamels and spatter some blood effects to have more visual interest. So we have specks and dots and pattern breakers, multiple variations in luminosity and coloration, different types of surface finishes, and much more. Lots of things I always seek to include when rendering flesh in the Grimdark style. Before jumping back to the Screamer, I wanted to remind you that, if you like these videos, make sure to comment and subscribe to our channel. And visit the grimdarkcompendium.com for hundreds of videos, color recipes, technique and faction-focused tutorials. Every bit of support is immensely appreciated. It really helps us and our small business, so thank you in advance. So let's go back to where I left our Screamer of Tzeentch. It's gonna be roughly the same process, with just a few changes purely dictated by my instinct. I will proceed with a pass of glue. Remember, I have to spread this very thin, so never drown the surface, and at the same time I have to pay attention to homogenize the glue using the applicator. So I take just a bit of glue every time, but I also have to do this relatively fast to avoid it drying on me. Then I proceed with a crimson filter, exactly like on the palette, keeping it thin at about 20 psi. I want this crimson in this sort of depression on the back, roughly near the tips of the fins. Of course, remember that the more intense we get this filtering pass, the bigger will be the accumulation of pigments during the removal pass. So I advise always going in short, controlled sprays. So I choose a spot and let the alcohol do most of the work, while I dab multiple times on the same spot. So the pigments start amassing in this way that looks like veins and bruises. And after that, I choose adjacent zones and clear one small spot at a time. And this is for when I want the veining effect. Otherwise, I just pass the brush more liberally for a bit of unpredictability, especially away from the fins. I think I'm going to need a bit of primer again to knock back a bit of this purple. That's looking a bit too extreme. So I restrict the nut at the end of my airbrush almost all the way in, and I use a 1-to-1 mix of pale sage and ivory primer, 22 to 25 psi, and I add 1 drop of water and 1 drop of isopropyl alcohol as well. This will make the color a bit more transparent, sort of like a glaze. So I can proceed to base out some of the other details of the miniature. The eyes are just a 1-to-1 mix of Abaddon black and a dark brown, while the back spines are just Abaddon black. Just notice that the very tips of the fins, the pinchers and the tail were mostly left untouched. This is very important as we want to keep some distinct coloration in some areas, just to give the model a bit more interest. Another pass of glue, and this time including the eyes, and purposely giving the pinchers and spines a bit more texture. And now here, instead of going with the Colia green shade, I went with Drakenhof Nightshade, just at the very tips of the fins. I feel this is much more appropriate for this creature. And I don't need much build-up of this color, it just needs to be a light glaze, placed in the right areas. Now we get to the removal pass, same thing as before, but this time I remove this in smaller patches, using the tip of my brush to get consistent veining patterns. I want to make sure they look different enough from the ones we obtained with the crimson, so that when we seal everything together, they look appropriately diverse. They go in slightly different directions, different size, and so on. They should complement each other, but still trying to not exaggerate or creating artificial looking patterns. So, I will get to another layer of glue, spread evenly just on the fins. Right now, there's no reason to cover the entire model, and I will adjust the surface variation anyway as I approach the finishing steps. I'm coming back with another pass of Drakenhof Nightshade, same pressure and same light hand. I make sure that the very tip is completely covered and that all the veins towards the end of the wings are slightly filtered. This time, I'm not going to remove any of this, as it needs to blend all the veining work together. This is starting to look interesting with a lot of coloration, blending, mottling, different levels of depth, and so on. Things that we should always look forward to include in a Grimdark flesh recipe. So now I can start working with some oils and turn down the luminosity a bit using a mix of Abteron 502 Dead Flesh and Field Grey, and tie this together with a dry, feathering brush. This intervention with oil paint has created the perfect playground for me to start coming in with all sorts of effects. First of all, the oil has knocked back the glossy surface variation quite considerably, but being translucent by nature, thanks to the feathering motion, the gloss still shines through. While with some enamels, I add a varied texture only and just only around the area of the eyes. The brownish coloration localized between the spines and the eyes is Villainy Ink Goon's Grime, while now some Caput Mortum is placed just around the eyeballs and pinchers. It's good practice to also come back to some of the edges with a highlight pass. If this were that of a humanoid, this would mean the forehead and eyebrows, maybe the bridge of the nose or something like that. While here I just limit this to the eyelids using Abteron 502 light flesh tone. This is straight out of the tube, and the bristles of my brush were just slightly damp with spirits, but there's actual no mineral spirits mixed into the oil. Make sure the brush is correctly loaded so we don't exaggerate with the quantity of pigment. For the eye pupils, I really want to make them look insanely creepy, and I went with just a simple black ink. And when this dries, it's gonna be interesting, because we're going to have two slightly different levels of gloss, one on top of the other. One from the cornea and the other from the center of the pupil. Again, it's another type of variation that I often like to see in organic surfaces. Never the same degree of gloss or satin in multiple repeated spots, but variations of them, selectively placed near each other. This directly guides me to come with Abteron 502 Black and pass it as a dry brush just on very specific areas. Not just for surface variation, but also for darkening purposes. This gets done at the very extremities, mandibles, the very tips of the fins and spines, Right now, it looks satin just because it's wet, but as it dries, it will bring even more variation and diversity. Due to how it reflects light, to me this area reads as very soft and tender skin. I think it's a pretty good looking effect. For this flesh recipe, we are constantly bringing a bit more coloration and mottling, and drawing out a bit more complexity with every pass. Small skin imperfections, veining, surface reflections, enamel texturing, everything contributes to making this feel multifaceted. Now, just when I was painting and recording the practice blank, I was talking to Zatkaskagun on the phone, and he told me about some close encounter with some type of invasive spider species, like a massive red and black hairy spider. And even small things like this sometimes can give us a bit of inspiration. So this little anecdote kinda creeped its way into the build in real time, as I got more and more subconsciously stimulated to turn this thing into a hairy abomination. Of course, the addition of hair further complements the flesh recipe by bringing even more variation. So, this was some of my insight on how I approach flesh recipes in the Grimdark style using the glue technique. With the way I want to represent characters and creatures, this technique integrates perfectly with the atmosphere I aim for, and helps me build layers and layers of variations. All textures, surface variations and effects are built organically as we progress with the miniature. But of course, we can always come back with some final varnishes or enamels and selectively place them, just to give the final accents if we need small details being matte or extreme gloss, while everything else is just a very interesting mix of all the facets in between. There's never just one flat finish, but a careful placement of all the possible finishes, which contribute to make this read realistic, with all these lights reflections, spots where it looks a bit more humid, areas that look soft, and so on. I've got to say, I always use this technique to great effect on humanoid 32mm models. The only difference is that the smaller the working area, the easier it is to start clogging details. So with smaller miniatures, just use 1, maximum 2 layers of glue and no more than that. With this one, I've counted about 4 layers in total. As long as you can keep it controlled and thin, you can do even more. I hope you found this video interesting and informative, and that it inspires you to look at flesh recipes from a different perspective. Even if you end up not using the glue technique, I feel there's plenty that you can hopefully take away from this video for your future flesh recipes and painting projects. This is all for today. Thank you for your time. I will see you in the next video.